and gentlemen, welcome to History Go Time!
Napoleon once said that history is a pack of lies agreed upon. This concept was perhaps more eloquently articulated when the historian Pierre Briand, in his book From Cyrus to Alexander, quoted the poet Leo Ferre, "You must believe in ancient history, even if it is not true." That's what I do. I'm not a historian, I'm a writer and a comedian. This show isn't about being historically accurate, although I do at all times strive for as much historical accuracy as possible. But when I'm presented with a choice between fact and fiction, well, as they say, you print the legend. I have a passion for history, but at heart I'm a storyteller. The story I want to tell you today is about the extraordinary life, and even more extraordinary death, of one Marcus Licinius Crassus, because it is all amazing. And when I say amazing, I mean from the perspective of a comedian living 2,000 years after him. I don't think he enjoyed his death so much himself. I'm actually pretty sure he didn't have a great time there. Marcus Crassus was one of the main dudes of the late Roman Republic, and one of the people who was, directly or indirectly, responsible for its collapse. The late Roman Republic is one of my favorite periods of history, but it's incredibly complex. I mean, there are two important people named Marcus Livius Drusus, who were father and son, and complete political opposites, so it's complicated. I'm going to be assuming you have some background knowledge here. If you're not versed in the subject, you should be fine, but you should probably know who people like Marius and Sulla were. Just generally, you should know this. History has a nasty habit of repeating. But back to Crassus. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the richest man in Rome. We don't know how rich Crassus was because you literally couldn't calculate how much money he had. The Romans used Roman numerals, they didn't have Arabic numbers yet. There weren't enough letters to describe how much money Marcus Crassus had. I mean, imagine if Jeff Bezos ate another Jeff Bezos and then had Bill Gates for dessert. That's the kind of money we're talking about. There was one point where Julius Caesar said to Crassus, "Hey, I need to borrow $500 million. And Crassus was like, "Yeah, no worries. Are you sure you don't want $1 billion? Here, take $1 billion. Pay me back whenever." Obviously, I'm doing currency conversions here. They'd be talking in things like talents, but the general principle holds up. Marcus Crassus was the kind of guy who, if you asked him for change for a 20, he'd be like, "Your 20s are change, bro." So, a wanker, in other words. It's worth talking about how Marcus Crassus came to be the wealthiest man in Rome. Crassus was originally a soldier, and he served under the command of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, as a lot of prominent people in the late Roman Republic tended to do. Now, Sulla takes a lot of backstory, which I'm not really going to go into here, but if you know your Roman history, you know why this is a big deal. Sulla was the fulcrum through which the Mediterranean world changed. Lucius Sulla was one of the most influential people in history, and Marcus Crassus worked for him. Crassus left the military, and he made his money in what Wikipedia very generously describes as, quote-unquote, real estate speculation, which is perhaps the most real estate-y way of saying that I have ever heard. One of the main ways that Crassus made his money was this. If there was a fire in Rome, that was generally a very bad thing. All of the houses and tenements tended to be very close together, and in the ancient world, pretty much everything tended to be very highly flammable. A fire was a bad thing because not only would your house burn down, but there was a very high chance that your neighbours' houses would burn down, and it was quite possible for the entire city to burn down as well. There's a thing known as the Great Fire of Rome for a reason. And Rome didn't have an official firefighting service. There was no fire department. There was something very much like a fire department. There were a bunch of people that fought fires, but they weren't civil servants. They were employed by Marcus Licinius Crassus. They were his personal fire department. When a fire broke out in Rome, Crassus would send his fire department down to the fire, and they'd get their bucket chain ready and gear up and get ready to fight the fire. And then they'd stop. They'd find the person who owned the house that was on fire, and then Crassus would begin the negotiations. How much would you be willing to pay for us to put out the fire? Remember, the longer your house burns down, the less collateral you have to pay with. Or he'd offer to buy the house outright in a literal fire sale. I see your house is on fire. I'm willing to buy if you want to sell. I'll give you pennies in the dollar, but good luck selling the ashes after it's burned down. See? Real estate speculation. He would, accurately, speculate that people did not like their houses being on fire, and he made a lot of money from that. He would also make the same offer to everyone in the neighborhood. Like, hey, there's a good chance this entire block is going to burn down. Who wants to make a buck? Remember, if your house is on fire and you're trying to hire the fire department, you're not in what the business world calls a strong bargaining position. See, it's not racketeering, it's real estate speculation. That house isn't on fire, it's a motivated seller. It's also worth pointing out that this whole arrangement only works when you've got fires to put out. And while Rome was an ancient metropolis swarming with people, and that it was quite a common occurrence for houses to catch fire, Marcus Crassus wasn't above, how should you say, speeding the process along, if you catch my drift. When the fire department is paid on a per-fire basis, you have something of a conflict of interest, you could say. This is a point that I bring up whenever someone tells me that they hate paying taxes. The lessons we learn from history. The other way that Crassus made his vast fortune was, astonishingly, even more shady than that. Remember how I said that he was a disciple of Sulla? Alright, well, a few years before this period, Rome had a huge civil war. I say huge because when you're talking about Rome, there are civil wars and then there are civil wars. This was the second kind. This was between the two most powerful dudes in Rome at the time, Lucius Sulla and Gaius Marius, and it got ugly. Even by Roman civil war standards, ugly, and they once sacked and pillaged Cremona, which is a Roman city. At the end, Sulla won the war, and he said, alright, this shit never happens again, right? And he put into place all of these reforms that would prevent another civil war from happening, and one of the measures he put in place was to execute anyone who had sided with Gaius Marius, and anyone who was related to anyone who sided with Gaius Marius, and anyone who was friends with anyone who supported Gaius Marius, and anyone with a name that sounded like Gaius Marius, and anyone that had the same haircut as Gaius Marius. You get the idea. These executions were called proscriptions, and in the end over 9,000 people were killed in these proscriptions. That's a lot of executions. In fact, if you openly grieved for someone who was proscribed, that in itself was a capital offense, and you were proscribed yourself and executed too. So what does this have to do with Marcus Licinius Crassus? Well, Crassus being Crassus, he saw a way to get some business done. Remember, he used to work for Sulla. Sulla listened to him. So when Sulla said, alright, we need to execute anyone sympathetic to Marius, do you know anyone? Crassus's eyes got those dollar signs in them, and he went, cha-ching, here's how we can make $1. So Crassus goes to Sulla and says, oh yeah, my next door neighbor, total Marian. We better kill him and let me take his house. And that dude that owns the brewery that is the major rival to my brewery, yeah, he's Team Marius as well. And that guy that owes me money, yep, he's a Marian. That guy that just cut in front of me in line voted for Marius the whole time. You can see how this might have been a problem for Rome. And you can see now that Marcus Crassus is what historians classically call a turd. I needed to paint the picture of who Marcus Licinius Crassus was so that it was clear moving forward that the dude was a total douche canoe. We all need to be 100% on board with how much of a dickbag Marcus Crassus was. And one of the benefits of not being a historian is that I can make the claim that Marcus Crassus was a dickbag and not need to write a peer-reviewed thesis to back it up. So, fast forward a few years, and there are 3 people who essentially run Rome. Rome is still technically a senatorial oligarchy, but these 3 people are so powerful that what they say goes. And they're known to history as the First Triumvirate, or to their enemies as the Three-Headed Dog. The Triumvirate is the Roman Republic's version of the Avengers. First there was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, usually known as Pompey. Sometimes Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, sometimes known as the Adolescent Carnifex, the Kid Butcher. Pompey was, at the time, Rome's greatest general. He was undefeated in battle, and he'd conquered places all over the known world. And when I say known world, I mean the world around the Mediterranean. If Pompey had made it to China, then the Chinese would have given him one straight up the jacksie, but that's another story. Pompey was a celebrity in Rome, like a rock star. He was kind of like if Elvis was a great general from antiquity. People loved him. They followed him around, they fawned over him, they wanted his autograph, they took selfies with him. You get the idea. Pompey was a big deal. The second triumvirate was Gaius Julius Caesar. You might have heard of him. This was all before he was a dictator, though, so all of the stuff that most people associate with Caesar, this is well before that. But at this time, Caesar was Rome's best politician. He was the crafty, cunning one. He was also one of the coolest people in Rome. He set fashion trends. He had an interesting fashion sense. Women wanted him. Men wanted him. And Caesar fucked almost all of them. I'll do another one of these shows just devoted to how accomplished Caesar was as a sex fiend. When Caesar returned from his Gallic campaign, one of the songs that his own troops who loved him to death, who were fanatically loyal, one of the songs they sang about Caesar went, according to Suetonius, who should never be believed, but this is how the song went. Romans, watch your wives, here comes the bold adulterous whore. He pissed away your golden goal and he's back to screw you more. And that's what his friends said about him. So if Pompey was Elvis, then Caesar was David Bowie mixed with Mick Jagger and a bald John Lennon. Oh, and he was also the Pontifex Maximus, the head of the Roman Church. So Caesar was basically the Pope at this point. It's not really relevant to this story, but I think it's interesting that the general who conquered Gaul, who killed hundreds of thousands of people, and had affairs with everyone's wives, and at least one king, was the Pope the whole time. The third triumvirate was, of course, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the man at the center of this story. The richest man in Rome, possibly one of the richest men ever. I mean, he had all of the money. And that's pretty much it. If Pompey was Elvis and Caesar was Bowie, then Crassus was Mark Zuckerberg. Pompey and Caesar were cool. Crassus was not cool. He was rich, but he wasn't cool. He wasn't glorious or adored. People didn't love him. And this is important. This is what's interesting about ancient Romans. They didn't really care about money. Well, they cared, but not as much as you'd think. Money was nice. They liked being able to lounge about and drink and have feasts and afford fancy prostitutes, but money wasn't the most important thing in the world to them. Money was a means to an end. What Romans cared about more than anything was fame and prestige. You earned money so that you could spend it on telling the world how awesome you were. You'd buy food for the poor, you'd hire gladiators and circuses and put on these huge free shows, you'd throw massive parties, and the whole time you'd tell everyone, hey, remember who's doing all of this for you. Basically, you would Great Gatsby the shit out of Rome. And that's what the Romans were all about. Money was only useful for advertising how amazing you were. Remember when I said that Caesar borrowed $1 billion off of Crassus? Well, that's because he'd gone that far into debt by spending money like crazy, throwing parties, handing out free bread and soup to the hungry and homeless, all these kinds of things. Caesar was making a play for Roman top dog, and he was making it rain on the reg. Money didn't mean much. It was all about how you were making Rome great. And Crassus, he hadn't done much to make Rome great. He'd done a lot to make Crassus great, but not the state of Rome. And this is very important. Pompey, he'd conquered into Africa and Asia, and he was famous for expanding the borders and bringing back slaves and money and treasure. Pompey actually plundered the cloak of Alexander the Great from Mithridates. Julius Caesar, he'd gone in the other direction and he'd conquered Gaul, which was arguably more amazing to the Roman people. Romans were shit scared of Gauls and Celts and Germans, and Caesar had conquered them. I mean, he even went as far as Britain. And Marcus Crassus? Well, Crassus had done jack shit. The purists are screaming at me at this point, but I'll get to that. To the Romans of the time, and for a long time, the greatest achievement, the height of honor and glory, was to be declared worthy of what was called a triumph. A triumph was a very special occasion reserved for the very greatest of Rome's citizens. It was earned through war and conquest and doing something truly exceptional in military service to the Roman state. Without going into the details, and there are a lot of details about tradition and religion and ceremony and whatnot, a triumph was a massive parade in which the victorious general would ride through the streets of Rome with his conquering army, and they had these huge artworks and floats depicting all of these incredible feats that they'd accomplished. It's kind of like if Mardi Gras was militarized and widely considered to be the most important thing in the world. So, to be given a triumph was the highest honor. Caesar had been given a triumph, although he declined it for very complicated reasons, but he would later get 4 triumphs. Pompey had celebrated 3 triumphs. Crassus had no triumphs. 0. He was sitting on a duck. And to Marcus Crassus, this would not do. Pompey and Caesar, they'd earned all of this great glory through conquest. What was stopping Crassus? I mean, it was called the Triumvirate after all, right? He was an equal partner, wasn't he? Well, Pompey was a military man his whole life, and he was the best general of the Republic. Caesar wasn't. He actually acquired his power through the church and politics, but as luck would have it, he turned out to be one of the best military commanders in the history of mankind. And it wasn't like Crassus didn't have any military experience himself. He commanded armies in successful campaigns. It's just that the major campaign he fought wasn't something that Rome was particularly proud of. Crassus was the guy in charge of the Roman side of the Third Servile War. You probably know it better as the slave revolt led by a Thracian gladiator by the name of Spartacus. Crassus fought that campaign. He beat Spartacus, and he was just about to proclaim his glorious victory. Pompey swept in with his army, and he took all the credit. And Crassus was just left sort of seething. To say that Marcus Crassus was upset by this is something of an understatement. To make himself feel better, he ordered that 6,000 of the prisoners he'd captured to be crucified and displayed on the main road into Rome. I mean, Crassus was a really fun guy. So Crassus had fought the Third Servile War, but he still hadn't earned his triumph. It's not like he went and conquered foreign lands. I mean, he put down a slave revolt. This wasn't a big deal to Rome. I mean, they're just slaves. So what? So if Caesar was off conquering Gaul, which, if you don't know, was France, Belgium, Britain, parts of Germany, and Pompey was off conquering the Balkans, where was left for Marcus Crassus to make his mark? Well, there was Syria. Specifically, a kingdom known as Parthia. Crassus would conquer Parthia. And this is widely regarded as a pretty bad move. Crassus, trying to compete with 2 of the best generals ever, had decided that to prove his awesomeness, he was going to conquer the kingdom that had previously resisted the conquest of 2 people known as the Great. The Parthians had resisted both Cyrus the Great of Persia and Alexander the Great of Macedonia. Purists coming at me, Parthians, Massagetae, same thing, right? So these steppe people that had previously fought off Cyrus the Great and Alexander the Great, Marcus Crassus, not the Great, was going to come in here and take them. So Crassus bought himself an army. He was rich, remember. And he marched off to conquer Parthia, which many people thought wasn't the best idea. He was warned. He was warned not to do this. There's a story that as Crassus was marching off to war, he went through the kingdom of Armenia, which was friendly to Rome, and he spoke with the king of Armenia and noticed that this king had ordered a monument built. And Crassus said to him something like, "Isn't it a little bit late in life to be building monuments?" And this king replied to him, "You should talk. I'm not the one invading Parthia." And off Crassus goes to invade Parthia. Now, Parthia is sort of on the border of modern-day Iran and Turkmenistan. It's a hostile desert place. It's basically Tatooine. It's nothing but rocks and desert and Tuscan raiders. And at this point in time, Parthia is full of Parthians. Parthians are real-life Tuscan raiders. The Parthians at this point are basically what the Mongolian Golden Horde will be based off. They're a nation of nomadic horse people. They have the best horses in the world, and each and every one of their horsemen would be like a circus trick rider today. They could do gymnastics on a horse. They sort of swirled around on the horses and jumped up and down, and they could spin in the saddle and things like that. The Parthians also have what is probably the most powerful single-person weapon in the world at this point, the recurved compound bow. This thing was way stronger than anything the West could make, and it had a substantially higher draw, and these people were incredibly accurate with them. A Parthian bow was the ancient equivalent of a sniper rifle. The Parthians also used what was known as the Parthian shot, oddly enough. It's actually named after them, and it will be used by a lot of horse archers throughout time, but probably to the greatest effect by the Mongols. Now, the Parthian shot is where these people would ride towards the enemy, shooting these incredibly powerful bows, and then they'd turn around and retreat. But as they retreated, they would turn around in their saddles and start shooting backwards, so they do twice the damage. Or if you decide to chase them, which is what they want, but you think they're retreating and they're routing, you're going to chase them and conquer them, they actually want you to do that. So your troops are opening themselves up to more arrows and getting shot more and more as they chase these Parthians who are shooting backwards. That's the Parthian shot. So you've got these horse archers with powerful ranged weapons. They're desert people on horseback. It's kind of like ancient Mad Max. So back to Marcus Crassus. He's decided that he wants to pick a fight with these dudes. So he and his army march off into Parthia. But they don't know their way around, and this is dangerous country. Not only can you get ambushed by these Parthian horsemen, you don't want to get lost in the desert. It's the only thing that's more dangerous than the Parthians. So he hires a local guide. And this local guide starts to take the Roman army deep into the desert. And after a few days of wandering around, the Romans start to get a bit sus, and they ask this guide what's up. And this guide says to them, "Oh, no, do not worry, I'm luring you into a trap." And the Romans are like, what? Did you just say you were luring us into a trap? And this guide is like, "I'm sorry, my Latin is not so good. I did not mean trap. I must have gotten the wrong word. I mean that I was attempting to do you harm with malice aforethought. Am I saying that right? I am trying to lure you to your deaths, you filthy capitalist dogs." Look, in my imagination, the Parthians have Russian accents, alright? When you do the show, you can decide the accents. So one morning, the Romans wake up, and this guide has disappeared during the night. And wouldn't you believe it, it was a trap all along. And what happens next is known to history as the Battle of Carrhae. Now, I'm not going to go through the blow-by-blow breakdown. You can find better and more accurate descriptions elsewhere. I'm sort of glossing over it like a Game of Thrones battle scene. But it was an absolute disaster for the Romans. The Romans fought in what was known as the testudo formation, the tortoise. This was where they'd all link their shields together and advance as one big group, looks sort of like a tortoise. And this worked really well against people like the Gauls, who were crazed madmen with huge swords and axes that went into battle naked and tried to overwhelm you with berserker strength. The Parthians didn't bother with any of that infantry stuff. They were all horse archers. And they had bows that could punch through Roman shields. So they just spent the day shooting Roman legionaries from a distance, right? Like they were Barry Pepper in Saving Private Ryan. "Here's my loving devotion, my fortress, my high tower, and my deliverer. Here's my shield, in whom I take refuge, who subdues people under me. Barry Pepper."
Over my way, thank you, sir. This entire mission is a serious misallocation of valuable military resources.
The Romans, for their part, are not enjoying this. They're not having a fun time. They can't withstand the missile fire, and they can't engage the enemy because the enemy are all mounted. They want you to chase them so they can shoot you some more. One of the more famous things about this battle is that the Roman strategy was sort of based on the Parthians running out of arrows at some point. The Romans would turtle up and they'd weather the storm until the Parthian ammunition ran out. Then the Parthians would either have to retreat or face the Romans in hand-to-hand combat, which was the Roman wheelhouse. What they didn't know was that the Parthians had brought extra camels loaded up to their necks with spare ammunition. The Parthians are doing the Captain America line, "I can do this all day."
I can do this all day.
Eventually, one of the Roman sub-commanders gets separated, or breaks off on his own initiative, accounts vary, and tries to take the fight to the Parthians. It does not go well. His entire unit is slaughtered. This commander just so happens to be Marcus Crassus's son. Accounts also differ over whether he was killed or whether he killed himself. This was a big deal to the Romans, even if the result was the same. It was better to fall on your sword than have a barbarian killing you, so something honor. I mean, it's like having two words for hanged and hung. It's all the same in the end. But big deal for the Romans. Anyway, the Parthians find his body and cut off its head and stick it on a pike. And then they ride back to the main Roman battle line and start waving it at Marcus Crassus. It's like, hey, look what we got. We got your son's head. Keep away. Keep away. Keep away Marcus Crassus' son's head. Look what we got. You got your son's head. What are you going to do about it? And at this point, it's getting pretty late. The sun's about to go down, and the Romans retreat back to their camp. Marcus Crassus, he's just watched this battle go entirely against him. It's a disaster. His son's been dead. They've taunted him with his son's head. Crassus is an absolutely broken man by this point. And by all accounts, he's just sitting in a daze doing a 1,000-yard stare. And it's at this point that the Parthians approach the camp and offer to parley with the Romans. Crassus just sits there doing the 1,000-yarder, but Crassus's troops, they aren't stupid. They know they're going to be wiped out. So they basically drag Marcus Crassus out to meet with the Parthians and try and hammer out some sort of truce that doesn't involve everyone's head being put on a stick. And basically, I've told you this entire story to get to this point. This is where the story gets really, really crazy. So this parley happens on neutral ground. The Parthian leader and a few of his bodyguards, and the Marcus Crassus and a few of his bodyguards, they sort of meet in between the two armies where no one else is around. And this negotiation is awkward because the Romans are proper fucked. The Romans know this, the Parthians know this, everyone knows this. So the Romans show up to the meeting, and the Parthian general, a guy by the name of Surena, he's a real dick about the whole thing. He knows he's beaten one of the Triumvirate, the mighty Marcus Licinius Crassus, and he is not going to die with the music in him. He is going to have some fun with this. You don't want to lament what might have been. Make hay while the sun shines. And Surena does. "Where is your horse, mighty Crassus?" he says. "It is a dishonor for a general so mighty to be dismounted so." And he orders his men to bring Crassus a horse. And the horse they bring is something else. It is the most amazing Arabian thoroughbred, just this magnificent horse. And it has a golden saddle and a silver bridle. There's gems all over it. This is the Lamborghini of all horses. This thing is far lap. And Surena, he makes Crassus get on it. He makes Crassus mount the horse and start to ride it. And then he tells Crassus to ride the horse, to trot back and forth. And then he makes him gallop in a little circle. And then he forces Crassus to get the horse to rear and walk on its hind legs. It's a really embarrassing sort of display. It's kind of like that scene in The Simpsons where Nelson makes fun of the really tall guy, and then the tall guy pulls him out of the sewer and marches him down the street with his pants down. "Trot for the people, Marcus! Wave to them! Now blow them kisses!" It's really embarrassing for Crassus. So after making Marcus Crassus parade on his horse for a bit, and having the entire Parthian army mocking him from a distance, things happen. We don't know for sure what happened, whether there was a weapon drawn, or the wrong thing was said, or there was just an accident, but suddenly shit got real. There was a skirmish, and the end result was that Marcus Licinius Crassus, conqueror of Spartacus, richest man in Rome, Triumvirate, was dead on the floor. And that's where the story ends, right? No, not at all. Not by a long shot. Crassus suddenly being dead disappointed the Parthians. They'd made a lot of plans for old Marky Mark, and most of these hinged on him being alive to be humiliated. So Surena and the Parthians, they weren't quite through humiliating Crassus. They had a lot of fun things in store for him, and they'd be damned if they'd let a little thing like the death of the man involved spoil all of their fun. You improvise, you adapt, you overcome. According to the legends, the Parthians cut off Crassus's head and then filled it with molten gold. Now, in this period, filling someone's head with molten gold wasn't as unusual as you might think, but in this case it was a firm middle finger to Crassus and his love of gold. Ha ha, you love gold so much, now your head's made from it. Plutarch describes it as a mockery of Crassus's thirst for wealth. Admittedly, the Parthians probably would have preferred for Marcus Crassus to be alive when they did this to him, but you work with what you've got, right? When life hands you dead Crassus, you make golden Crassusade. Then they took Marcus Crassus's body, and I'm not quite sure how to put this. They made it into a puppet, so that they could mock the puppet. They had a Crassus puppet to do shows with. I'm Marcus Crassus. I thought I could invade Parthia. Now my head's made of gold. Blah, blah, blah. The story Plutarch tells is that Crassus's head was made into a kind of like a trophy for the winners of the Battle of Carrhae. And eventually the head trophy and the Crassus puppet, they found their way back to the city of Artashat, which was the capital of Armenia. And this was where the son of the king of Parthia was having his wedding festivities at the time. He was getting married and he was having his bachelor party there. And one of the festivities was a play, it was Bacchae by Euripides, which features, rather notably, a severed head. Yep, Neil Gaiman borrowed this one for Sandman. One of the lead actors, a Greek by the name of Jason of Tralles, saw what we in the business call comic timing, and he started riffing. He ditched the fake head that was used in the production and picked up the real head of the actual Marcus Crassus and started doing like an Alas Poor Yorick with the real head of the actual Marcus Crassus in this play, the Bacchae. And the crowd goes wild. Standing ovation, mic drop, 5 stars, game day, bucket go boom. This still wasn't the end though. The Parthians still had a lot of plans for Crassus. They had been planning their humiliation of him ever since he declared his intentions to invade Parthia. It's like when you spend the night thinking about what you wish you'd said to that jerk in the supermarket, except that the supermarket is Parthia, that jerk is Marcus Crassus, and the things that you wish you'd said are horrible tortures that you just thought of. The Parthians put a lot of work into this, and they'd be damned if they were going to let a little thing like the guy they planned on humiliating being dead stop them. So, here's what they did. They went through all of the Roman prisoners that they'd taken at the Battle of Carrhae, the thousands and thousands of prisoners, and they found the one who most looked like Marcus Crassus. This poor bastard, Caius Pacianus, was hauled out of the line by the Parthians. They stripped him of all his clothes, and then they made him put on women's clothing. And then they said to him, guess what? You're Marcus Crassus now. They took him back to the capital, and they put him on a horse, still dressed in women's clothing. They put him at the head of the prisoners they'd taken, and they led him through all of the streets, and the Parthians taunted and jeered him the whole way. It was like the shame thing from Game of Thrones. And it was in this way. Dead, turned into a puppet in a play, head filled with molten gold, dressed in women's clothing, taunted and jeered by the people who had defeated him in the most comprehensive Roman defeat since Hannibal Barca at Cannae, and played by an entirely different person who had the misfortune of looking kind of like him. In this way did Marcus Licinius Crassus finally get his triumph. No matter how rich you are, you can't take it with you. And at the end of the game, the king and the pawn go back in the same box. And in this game, the Marcus Crassus head and the Marcus Crassus body went back in entirely different boxes. And if you think this is the last time that a shady, rich real estate mogul has been turned into a puppet by a hostile Eastern Empire, well, history has a nasty habit of repeating.